Hello and welcome to the screencast for Chapter 4, the Market Forces of Supply and Demand. When goods are bought and sold, this happens in a market. A market is basically, as you can see from the definition here, a place where a group of buyers and sellers of a particular good or service meet. A market can be anything. It could be like a farmer's market. That's typically what we think of as a market, but it could be any shop where the shop is selling something and you're the customer walking in, you're buying something. It could be online, of course. In other words, it could be virtual, where you've got online sellers in cyberspace who are basically selling goods and services, and you are the customer perusing or using the internet to purchase those goods and services. So the way in which we think about this in economics is that for each market, we can split the market into those people who are buying products and those people who are selling products, the buyers and the sellers. The buyers determine what we call the demand for the product. The sellers determine the supply of the product. And the important point to remember here is that the two are assumed to behave quite differently. And we're going to explore how that is and why that is. Okay, so just think about a market and think about two different types of what we call economic agents, two different types of individuals. Those people who are trying to purchase goods and services and those that are trying to sell goods and services. Now, one of the things that we're going to assume here is that the market is competitive. Now, in economics, that means that we make a whole bunch of assumptions. Those assumptions are that there are tons of buyers and tons of sellers. So we don't have a situation which we talked about in class like a monopoly, where there's just one seller and lots of buyers. We have a situation which is called perfect competition, where there are tons of sellers. Usually you have to assume that there are almost infinite amount of sellers and an infinite amount of buyers. Each, therefore, cannot really affect the market price. The market price is determined by the market, and the price is set as buyers and sellers come together in the market. The other assumptions that we have to make are that there's no difference between the goods and services being sold in this market. They're identical. They're absolutely the same. And that assumption in economics is called homogeneity. Homogeneity. H-O-M-O-G-E-N-I-E-T-Y. E-I-T-Y, sorry. So that's a key assumption as well. That means there's no difference in the quality of the products. There's no difference in the features of the products. So, there's no branding allowed here. And, as it says, the second bullet point there, buyers and sellers are so numerous. So, as I said, every buyer and seller has no effect, whatever their actions, on the market price. They're what we call in economics price takers. They're not price setters. Price setters, would be a price setting company would be like Microsoft. It's a virtual monopoly. It sets the price. So we're not allowing that here. All the firms have to be price takers. They can only sell at the price that's in the market. And the same with the buyers. They can't bargain the price down. They can only take it or leave it at the price that's offered in the market. But at the market price, whatever it is, the buyers can sell all they want, and the sellers can. The buyers can buy all they want, and the sellers can sell all they want. As I already talked about this in class, a monopoly. There are other different what we call market structures. Perfect competition is one of them, and it's the one that we need when we're doing demand and supply, basic demand and supply analysis as we're doing here. There are others, and you already know about the monopoly. It's where the industry consists of just one firm. There are no other firms. So as I said, the monopolist is a price setter. It's not a price taker. There are the different forms of market structure as well, between the extremes of perfect competition and monopoly. And the two major ones are what we call imperfect competition, where you can have branding. There are quite a few firms, but not a really large number of them, and many consumers. And then another form of a market is an oligopolistic market, or an oligopoly, where there are very few firms. And here in particular, there's advertising and branding and etc., etc. And they can try and differentiate their products from each other. We're not going to do those in this course, but that's something that you would do if you took principles of microeconomics. So let's start off on the demand side. So we're dealing with the purchasers of the goods and services here. And what we're going to look at is, given the market price, how much do people want? How much do the buyers want? In other words, they're willing and able to purchase. And we try and encapsulate this in what we call the law of demand. Now, the law of demand here should be in really in inverted commas, because it's really not a law. Why do I say that? Well, because think about laws. The law of gravity. The law of gravity applies in all cases where you have, for instance, two masses. We know that they will attract each other. There are no exceptions. A law in the physical sciences is a rule. Now, the law of demand in economics is not a rule, because there are exceptions. So it's really a rule of thumb, I would call it, but it doesn't stop your textbook and most economics courses from labeling it the law of demand. Now, to get the law of demand, we need a sweeping assumption, and the sweeping assumption is called ceteris paribus. And this is used a lot in economics. It means that everything else remains equal. That's what ceteris is, all things, paribus, equal. So it comes from Latin. And I hated Latin in high school, but anyway, that's another story. So once we've got the ceteris paribus assumption, the law of demand is that when the price of a good rises, the quantity demanded of the good falls, ceteris paribus. So notice there are three elements here. The price of the good goes up, the quantity demanded of the good falls, that's the second thing, and the third thing, which is very important, is the ceteris paribus. And of course vice versa. If the price of the good falls, the quantity demanded of the good rises. So there's an inverse relationship between the two, is what the law of demand basically is, holding everything else constant. By the way, why do we need that holding everything else constant, the ceteris paribus? Well, if you think about it, we need it because if that's not the case, if other things are allowed to change, then the law of demand is no longer valid, no longer valid at all. So if we allow income to go up at the same time as the price of the good rises, then the law of demand probably wouldn't hold. So, or maybe not hold. So that's why we need the ceteris paribus. And the way in economics that we kind of display the law of demand is, we can do it in various ways, but the two main ways is to look at, first of all, the demand schedule, which is a table. It shows the relationship between the different prices that the good could be set at and the amount demanded of the good in the market at each of those prices. Once we've got the table, we can actually plot that on a graph, plot the relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. Now, to get the market demand, obviously, as I've said, there are lots of firms and there are lots of individuals. So we start with one individual, and the individual demand is just the demand of that one individual. So let's look at Catherine. Here's her demand schedule. So there are the different prices. If the price was 0 for an ice cream cone, Catherine would demand 12 cones. If it's 50 cents, she demands 10 cones, etc., etc., till if it's $3, she doesn't want any cones. So you can see as the price goes up, as we move down that left-hand column of the table, the next column in, which shows the quantity falls. So price goes up, quantity falls. It obeys the law of demand. We can plot that, of course, on a graph. And here you're seeing the graph being plotted by plotting those individual points, those individual rows of the table. And here we can see what happens, that from one particular price, say we were at $2, Catherine would want 4 ice cream cones. If the price drops to $1.50, Catherine would want 6 ice cream cones. By the way, I think this is a little bit of a strange example. They often give strange examples for this principles course in all the texts virtually, but in terms of ice cream cones, come on, I mean, could you really eat 10 ice cream cones? I don't think so. But in any case, just suspend belief for a moment and assume that you would and could eat that many ice cream cones. Whoops, sorry about that. So, next, if we're going to get from the individual demand curve, which we've done for this individual called Catherine, to the market demand, what we have to do is sum all the individual demands for the good or service to get the market demand. And we do that not by summing vertically, because that would be adding up the prices. We sum horizontally, because that means we're adding up the quantities. And what we should get is that the total quantity demanded of a good varies inversely with the price, ceteris paribus, which is the law of demand again. So here we have another guy, well, another person called Nicholas, and we can add their two demands together. So at each price, we look at the quantity that each individual would demand of the good to get the market demand. Now let's assume that there were only 2 individuals. We can add up across those individuals as is shown in the first row. You can do that for all the other rows. Basically what you can see is that the price of the ice cream cone, as it goes up in the left hand column, the market demand goes down in the right hand column. That's the law of demand. And of course that means we can plot it. We've plotted this for each of the demand curves, and what we're doing is summing the demand curves horizontally. So for instance, here you can see at a price of 2, Catherine's demand is 4 ice cream cones, Nicholas's demand is 3 ice cream cones, 4 plus 3 is 7 ice cream cones, which is what we get on the market demand curve to the far right. Okay, so far so good. So we've got the idea of the moving along the demand curve, meaning as the price goes up, ceteris paribus, quantity demanded of the good goes down in the market. What happens though if we are not ceteris paribus? In other words, if we allow one of the things that we've kept fixed to vary? Well, then the whole demand curve will shift, and it shifts either left or right. And the language that we use, you can see on this slide, if the demand curve shifts to the right, we call that an increase in demand. An increase in demand. Notice what this means. It's not an increase in the quantity demanded given a price change. It's an increase in the quantity demanded at every price, so without the price change. Okay, so that's how you distinguish between the idea of a shift in the demand curve versus a movement along a demand curve. And the same obviously goes for a decrease in demand. Here, what we're doing is at any given price, the quantity demanded is going to fall. That's a decrease in demand, and the whole demand curve shifts to the left. We can show this in terms of our ice cream example. If there's an increase in demand, at any given price, the whole demand curve, labeled D1 there in blue, shifts to the right to give demand curve D2, which is to the right. If there's a decrease in demand, it shifts to the left to demand curve D3. What are the things that can shift the demand curve around? In general terms, these are listed here, and we're going to cover each of them separately. So income is the first thing that we usually look at, prices of related goods, tastes and fashion, expectations, and then the number of buyers in the market. So let's look at those separately. Let's start off with income. Usually we make the assumption that if we have an increase in income, at every price, consumers will want more of the good. And we have a special name for that in economics. It means that we call the good or service a normal good or service, if that's the case. So, with a normal good or service, everything else remaining fixed, of course, the price and all those other factors that we've just looked at, or we haven't just looked at, that I listed on the previous slide, all those factors staying constant, ceteris paribus, an increase in income leads to an increase in demand. Now there is the other case, the opposite case, where an increase in income leads to a fall off in the amount demanded in the market. Most goods are normal goods. Occasionally we get an inferior good. Students often ask me, like, what kind of inferior good? Or what kind of good is an inferior good? Well, probably the best example is something like what I used to eat when I was a student was macaroni and cheese. When my income went up, when I finished being a student, I didn't rush out and buy a ton more macaroni and cheese. When my income went up, I actually decreased the demand that I had for macaroni and cheese. So, in other words, macaroni and cheese for me was an inferior good. Now, many students tell me these days they eat what they call ramen noodles. So, ramen noodles for most of you guys, I guess, would be the equivalent of macaroni and cheese for me. So, that's an inferior good for you in the sense that when you graduate, hopefully, then when your income goes up, you're not going to rush out and buy more ramen noodles, you're going to buy less ramen noodles. Now, I'm not going to talk about inferior goods again. They are an exception. For the most part, we assume that all goods are normal goods. So we've done income now. We're looking at prices of related goods. We also have a split here. So let's think about ice cream. Ice cream can either have other goods whose prices vary that are substitutes or what we call complements. Now a substitute is a good that can be substituted for that good. So think of a substitute for ice cream. Well, the obvious one, I guess, is frozen yogurt. So with these two goods, if you have an increase in the price of one, say we had an increase in the price of frozen yogurt, ceteris paribus, without anything else changing, that's going to affect the demand for our good because these two are very similar products. So if frozen yogurt is suddenly more expensive, it means people will increase their demand for ice cream. So that's a substitute. What about a complement? What goes with ice cream? Well, I can think of sprinkles, I can think of chocolate sauce or something like that. So those are complements, they go together. Now, if you have an increase in the price of chocolate sauce, for instance, that goes with ice cream or those sprinkles, then because the two go together, an increase in that price, for example, means that as a package, because they go together, the increase in the total has gone up. So even though there's been no increase in the price of ice cream itself, what it can lead to, or what it does lead to, is a decrease in the demand for ice cream because effectively there's been an increase in the package, in the combination which most people put together, if you like. So in this case, the two goods are complements. Now notice we said prices of related goods. There are obviously a lot of goods that are not related to ice cream at all. For instance, the price of BMWs. In that case, if the price of BMWs goes up, you wouldn't expect any change to the demand for ice cream. Okay, so they have to be related in some way for this effect to work. So always try and think about, if two goods are mentioned, whether they are substitutes or complements. So for instance, let me give you another example. Take butter. What would be a good substitute for butter? Well, the obvious one is margarine. What would be a good complement for butter? Obviously, bread. So there you go. The third thing that can affect demand is tastes or fashions. And these can shift the demand curve around. If the product is suddenly in with consumers, very trendy to have for whatever reason, then that obviously boosts demand. If for some reason the product is not appealing to consumers anymore, then that will obviously shift demand to the left. Next is expectations about the future. So there's really a split here as well. If we expect an increase in income, so in other words, if everyone expects to be better off and they know their income is going to go up, then often that will cause them to go out shopping today, and that will automatically increase current demand for products. On the other hand, if we expect higher prices for goods, and think of oil prices, for instance, if we all know that oil prices are going up significantly, what does that make us do today? Well, we go out and buy more gas today. So higher future prices, if we know that they're coming and they're coming down the line, that's going to boost our demand today. The last factor is the number of buyers. If we see that increase, in other words, there's more people in the market, then that obviously boosts market demand. So here's a summary, a table summary of what I call the ceteris paribus factors, the things that we assume fixed when we draw the demand curve, and what happens if they are no longer fixed, and how they change that demand curve around, how they shift that demand curve to the right or the left. So here's a case study. If we wanted to reduce the quantity of smoking, so in other words the demand for cigarettes, then there are various ways that we could do that. The first is to make cigarettes, or try and make them unpopular with consumers. So one way is to appeal to consumers about the health hazards of smoking, so public service announcements. Secondly, to really go to town and put mandatory health warnings on the cigarette packets, and I know that we've got really rather graphic pictures coming on cigarettes fairly soon that you'll see, warning of the dangers with graphic illustrations. And the third thing is the prohibition of cigarette advertising on TV. In other words, trying not to make them look alluring and attractive in any way at all. If successful, of course, that shifts demand to the left. The second way is to try and raise the price of cigarettes, and one thing that the government does is to tax the manufacturer of cigarettes, whoever they are, Philip Morris or Altria, I think they're called now, British Tobacco as well, and all the other, and Camel and all the others are all taxed. Taxing the manufacturer obviously is going to lead to a higher price. Well, we know from our economics already what that's going to do. A higher price means a movement along the demand curve. In other words, price goes up, quantity demanded is clearly going to fall. In general, when the price of cigarettes goes up by 10%, that leads to a 4% drop in demand for cigarettes and therefore smoking. Interestingly, in one particular group, teenagers, the effect is even more marked, even more obvious. 10% increase in price leads to 12% drop in smoking. Why do you think that is? Well, partly the reason obviously is because teenagers are more price sensitive. So in other words, when the price goes up, they're going to cut their demand by more. Also, we've got to think about if we do that, though, what the substitutes are for cigarettes. And obviously, the government's concerned about if it raised the price of cigarettes too much, would that boost the demand for marijuana, for example? And so that's obviously a public policy concern. But it appears that, in fact, marijuana and cigarettes appear to be more complements than substitutes. What does that mean? It means that people who smoke marijuana tend to also smoke cigarettes. So, in fact, people who give up smoking tend to give up smoking both illegal and non-illegal, in other words, legal substances, so things like cigarettes. And just to hammer this home, here we have basically a change in policy. In other words, those adverts on TV putting the graphic pictures on the cigarette packs, that's going to shift the demand curve. So that number one in our list of possible ways to reduce the quantity of smoking here, shift the demand curve. That's going to shift the demand curve to the left, obviously. And we can see that here with the demand curve shifting. So in other words, given the price, then the quantity falls. So that's a shift in demand. When we're looking at increasing the price, though, of cigarettes, that's a different issue. And here, we know that if we tax the manufacturer of cigarettes, essentially that pushes the price up for consumers. What's that going to lead to? It's not going to lead to a shift in the demand. It's going to lead to a movement along the demand curve. In other words, from point A to a point like B. What does the government actually do? Well, it does both. So it both taxes and shifts. So to do a proper analysis here, you would do both the left-hand diagram and the right-hand diagram together. Okay, so that's given you an example. Let's move on to supply now. Once we've done demand, supply actually is pretty quick. So the quantity supplied is the amount of a good that any producer is willing and able to sell. And here once again we try and encapsulate the behavior of the firms who are supplying the goods and services by a rule of thumb which in economics we call the law of supply. And what does the law of supply say? It says when the price of the good rises, quantity supplied of the good rises. Ceteris paribus. So that's the law of supply. Notice the three things again. Price of good rises, quantity supplied rises, ceteris paribus. Now why is that? Students often get a little bit puzzled about this. Well, remember the ceteris paribus is really key here. So, how do companies, or why do companies operate? Well, they operate to make a profit. What are their profits? Well, it's their revenues minus their costs. So, when the price goes up, their costs don't change. Clearly, it pushes their revenues up, so they make more profits. Opportunity cost says that if you're making more profits out of one product, ceteris paribus, in other words, nothing has changed with any of the other products, what are you going to do? You're going to move more resources into the production of that product. Hence, the quantity supplied of the good is going to rise. If something is very profitable, obviously what you tend to happen, in other words, is for resources to flow into production of that particular product. So that hopefully explains what the law of supply is about. I'll try and go over that in class as well, just to make sure you all understand it. So once again, we have the same idea here with suppliers with demand. We have a supply schedule. It's a table, and it shows the relationship between the price and the quantity supplied, and we can express that in terms of a supply curve, in other words, on a graph. Same thing. And we have individual suppliers. They're the individual firms usually, and then we're going to aggregate them up to look at the market supply, where we're going to add up the supply of each of the firms. So here's a particular supplier. He's called Ben. I think this might have something to do with Ben and Jerry's somehow, but there you go. What what you can see is the schedule on the left, which shows that as the price goes up, Ben supplies more ice cream cones. So if the price is 0, he's not interested in supplying any. At 50 cents, he's not interested in supplying any. Only when the price reaches 1 will he start supplying ice cream cones. And then as the price goes up, Ben is going to supply more ice cream cones to the market. So that shows you the supply curve being upward sloping. And if we want to get the market supply, we clearly have to sum up all the different firms or individuals supplying products to the market. And once again, we sum that up horizontally. So same idea. So here we have, here's Jerry, Ben and Jerry. So here we just sum them up. Notice we're summing up the quantity again. We're not summing up the price. That wouldn't make sense. We're summing up the quantity because remember, they're price takers. It's whatever the price is in the market determines how much each is going to supply in terms of their quantity. You add up all those different quantities. So for example, you can see from this table, if the price is $1.50, Ben will supply 2 and Jerry will supply 2 as well, giving a market supply of 4. If we're going to do this graphically, what we do is we plot the two supply curves for the two firms and add those up. So here you can see at price 2, for instance, Ben supplies 3 ice cream cones, Jerry supplies 4 ice cream cones, and so the market supplies 7 ice cream cones. So we've really talked about shifts along the supply curve. Now I've got to do the same thing for supply and talk about shifts in the supply curve. And this is changing those ceteris paribus factors once again, but the ceteris paribus factors for supply. So any change that causes an increase in quantity supplied at a given price shifts the demand curve to the right, and vice versa for shifting it to the left. So here we have an example of a supply curve shifting to the right if it's an increase in supply, or shifting to the left if it's a decrease in supply. Notice we're not saying quantity supplied here either. Like we didn't say when the curve shift with demand, we didn't say a change or a shift in quantity demanded. A shift in supply means a shift in the supply curve, the whole curve. So what are these ceteris paribus factors that we usually look at? Well, here they are: input prices, technology, expectations about the future, and the number of sellers. So let's deal with each of these separately like we did for demand. So first of all, input prices. Now remember, what's the firm in business for? To make a profit. Profit equals revenue minus costs. Input prices are a cost to the firm. So if input prices go up, it means their costs go up, it means their profits go down. If the profits go down, that means they're not going to make as much profit from producing this particular product. They'll shift resources out of this producing this particular product into another product. So what happens is that if the input prices go up, then the supply curve should shift to the left. A decrease in supply, in other words. So that's the first one. Oh, and by the way, and vice versa. So if input prices go down, of course, the supply curve is going to shift to the right, an increase in supply, in other words. Technology is the second factor here, and if we have an advance in technology, usually it means it's cheaper to produce each unit of the product. It's equivalent to like a decrease in input prices. It's clearly going to shift the supply curve to the right. In other words, an increase in supply. What about expectations about the future? Well, these can affect the supply curve. In particular, if we have expected higher prices, so if the prices are expected to be higher tomorrow, then the supplier is going to say, well, why do we need to supply all this stuff into the market today when we can hold back some of it and supply it if the price is going up tomorrow? So we'll decrease supply now in order to supply more tomorrow. So if we're expecting higher prices, The suppliers, the firms, usually decrease their supply now, shifting the supply curve to the left. The last factor is the number of sellers. If that increases, then the market supply increases, shifting the supply curve to the right. So here are the variables that the ceteris paribus factors, again, if you like, for the supply curve that shift the supply curve around. That's the last 4 rows of this table. Now, what we've got now is we've got the demanders and the suppliers, and what we want to do is put them together. We've looked at the demand curve and shift in the demand curve as determining the number wanted by the consumers at any given price in the market. We've got the same thing for suppliers in terms of, how much is supplied in the market is determined by the supply curve. And of course, that's the market supply curve, the supply of all the firms added together. So if we put those together, basically we're going to get demand supply on the same diagram. And if one curve is upward sloping, it's the supply curve, and the demand curve is downward sloping, then clearly they're going to cross. And when where they cross is going to be what we call an equilibrium. And that equilibrium is a situation where the supply coming from those firms is exactly equal to the amount that consumers want. So in other words, we can say, and look at the second bullet point here, that if we're in equilibrium, the quantity supplied will equal the quantity demanded. The quantity supplied by the firms will equal the quantity demanded by the consumers. In other words, it's where the supply and demand curves intersect. And that gives you the equilibrium price. The equilibrium price is such that those quantities supplied and demanded are equal. It's sometimes called the market clearing price as well, because of course at that price all the consumers go home happy. They've all managed to buy however much they wanted of the product at that price. All the suppliers go home happy as well. Why? Because they've got none left over. So that's why it's called market clearing. It clears the market. And the equilibrium quantity is obviously the amount that's sold. So we can represent that on a diagram. And here we've got our ice cream cone demand, and we've got our ice cream cone supply. And as you can see, they cross at $2. So that means that the market clearing or the equilibrium price is $2, which means that the equilibrium quantity or market clearing quantity is 7 units, of ice cream cones. What that means is that suppliers at that price at $2 are going to supply 7 ice cream cones, and the consumers at that price, they want 7 ice cream cones. So that's how many is supplied. The firms are happy because all their supply is bought. The demanders are happy because they buy all they want to as well. So the market, as we say, clears. Now what happens if we're not at the equilibrium price? Well, we have a situation. Let's go back to the diagram to just understand where that is. What we have is if, in other words, the price is higher than $2, say it was $2.50 or $3, then what's the situation? The situation at $2.50, for instance, if you follow it across, is that demanders only want around 5 ice cream cones, but the suppliers are willing to supply 10 ice cream cones. So quite a difference. So the market clearly doesn't clear at that price. We call that, by the way, a surplus, where the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. It's sometimes also known as excess supply. So a surplus or excess supply, you'll see either of those terms used. And it's not an equilibrium. But the key thing about it is that it's not sustainable for a really long time at that level. Why? Because there's going to be downward pressure on the price at that level of price. There's going to be movements along the demand and supply curves such that there's going to be an increase in the quantity demanded and a decrease in the quantity supplied. Why is that? Well, a price like $2.50 or $3 on the previous slide, the suppliers realize that they are not selling all their product that they're bringing to market. So they're saying, well, why do we produce so much? So that means next time they'll produce less. That'll obviously cause the price to drop. The demand will want a little bit more of it, and they'll keep on doing that until we get back to the equilibrium price. If we have the opposite situation, where the price is below the equilibrium price, in other words, let me go back to the diagram again. Here, if we have a price of, say, $1 or $1.50, if you trace that over, you can see that at, say, $1.50, the amount demanded is supplied is 5. The amount demanded is 9 or something like that. And so, in other words, demanders, the consumers, want more than the firms are willing to supply. So there's what we call a shortage. So we have, once again, we're not in equilibrium at 150. We have what's called an excess demand. In other words, quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. We can't stay there for a real long time. Why? Because there's going to be upward pressure on the price. Essentially, there will be consumers that go away unhappy because at that price they would have bought more, and they're going to tell the suppliers that. They're going to say, well, at that price I would have bought more. So the suppliers will say, okay, next time we come we'll bring more. But to do that, we're going to have to put more resources into this activity, and therefore that's going to push up the price. Pushing up the price will mean that consumers will want less, etc., until we get to equilibrium. So here we have excess supply, say at 250, and you can see what the surplus is. The surplus is 10 minus 4, which is 6. Here we have excess demand, say the price is at 150, and there you can see that the shortage is 10 minus 4, or 6. So in the first case, there's going to be stuff left on the shelf because the price is too high. In the second case, there's going to be consumers still wanting the good, but there's none left on the shelves at all. In other words, the market hasn't cleared. Only at $2 does the market clear. So, putting these two things together, the law of supply and demand, basically what it means is that the price is going to adjust in any market as long as there's no external interference, and as long as the market participants, make it clear that they would have bought more, or the firms, understand that there's a surplus, for instance, if there's stuff left over, then the price is going to adjust. It's going to adjust to bring the market back into equilibrium. And in fact, in most markets, those surpluses and shortages are temporary. So we do get to equilibrium quite quickly. There's a few markets where that's not the case, by the way, and I guess the housing market is one of those, and we're seeing that right now, where there's a lot of houses there and no one to buy them. In other words, there's a surplus, so that's why house prices are still falling. And they can fall over a number of years in the housing market. But that's not the case for most markets. In most markets, they clear pretty quickly. Okay, so putting this all together, if I give you a problem that involves demand and supply, there are always 3 steps to analyzing any change in the equilibrium. This is really what I call the 3-step method. First of all, decide whether the event shifts the supply curve, the demand curve, or in some cases both curves. Second, decide whether the curve shifts to the right or the left, which you should know given that you understood everything that we've done so far. And then shove it on a diagram, compare the initial and the new equilibrium, and look at the effects on the price and the quantity. Now, some of you probably think, hey, I can do this stuff in my head. Well, I would always advise you to do this 3-step analysis and also to draw the diagram, because sometimes you can get confused if you try and do it in your head. If you write it down on a piece of paper or whatever, then it becomes usually pretty clear what's going on. So let's look at an example. So we have, say, a shift in demand due to very hot weather one summer. you have to think about where the author here, Mankiw, lives. He lives in Boston, okay? So we have a very hot summer every summer, right, in Corpus Christi. So this really doesn't apply too much to us, but think of it from his point of view. What's going to be the effect on the market for ice cream up in Boston area, for example? Well, the hot weather is going to shift which curve? Well, it's obviously going to increase the demand, so it's going to affect consumers, not producers. So it may affect producers, of course, as a second round effect. But here you've always got to think, who is going to react first? Is it going to be the consumers? Is it going to be the demanders, in other words, or the suppliers, the producers? So in this case, hot weather means that the demand curve will shift. Which category are we talking about? Well, it's tastes. Basically, it's an increase in the taste for ice cream. So the demand curve is going to shift in which direction? Well, clearly to the right. What's that going to lead, or what's going to happen when it does shift to the right? Well, here you can see, and I think it's on the next diagram, you can see our initial equilibrium. If you shift it to the right, shift the demand curve from D1 to D2, you're looking at the new equilibrium, which is where the red demand curve D2 intersects the supply curve. It's at a price of 250 and a quantity demanded of 10. So that's the new equilibrium. So we've moved from the old equilibrium of $2.07 units to 250 and 10 units. So what's happened to the price? Well, the price has gone up in the market. What's happened to the equilibrium, quantity demanded and supplied? It's clearly gone up as well. So that's the answer to that problem. So here you can see point 3, a higher equilibrium price, a higher equilibrium quantity is the result. Now, just to kind of hammer this home as well, we'll come back to the shifts versus the movements along the curves. Remember, a shift can happen to either the supply curve or the demand curve, and it relates to all those factors that we went through before. If we have a movement along the curve, it means that those factors haven't changed. All we're doing is changing the price, and that's changing the quantity in some way. That's really what this whole slide says. So let's look at, for instance, change in market equilibrium due to something going on the supply side. So let's assume that one summer we have a hurricane that destroys part of the sugarcane crop. That means that in the market for sugar, we're going to see less supply, so the sugar supply curve will have shifted to the left, and that means a higher price for sugar. What's going to be the effect on the market for ice cream? Well, sugar is an input into making ice cream. So what does that mean? It means that the cost of making ice cream is going to go up. What does that tell you about what the producers are going to do? Well, at any given market price, the producers are going to say, hey, we're making less profits. Because, of course, that's what they're in business to do, make profits at this price. So we're going to produce less ice cream. So a change in the price of sugar is going to affect the supply curve. That's the first thing, number one there. Number two, the supply curve is going to shift which way? It's clearly going to shift to the left because it's an increase in input prices. And what's the third effect? Well, once again, I would draw the diagram. You can see the answer here, but let's draw the diagram. We've got the market for ice cream here. The initial equilibrium is $2.07 ice cream cones. Here we're going to basically increase input prices. That means at any given price, the whole supply curve shifts to the left. And that causes, of course, the equilibrium price to increase. So what is the total effect? Well, the equilibrium price goes up. You can see from 2 to 250. At the same time, the amount of ice cream cones falls from in the market from 7 to 4. Now, what's actually happened here? Well, really what we've done is the supply curve shift has caused an increase in the price. But but that means consumers have reacted as well. And remember that the market equilibrium comes about through the suppliers and the demanders interacting in the market. So the higher price has caused the consumers to cut back how much they buy. And you can see that from 7 to 4. So that's really what's happening. So when we look at this diagram, in a way, it's two things. It's a shift in supply and it's a movement along the demand curve. Both of those things happening at the same time to get us to our new equilibrium. So going back to look at, see, what the result is here. Number 3, we're going to get a higher equilibrium price and a lower equilibrium quantity, which is what we just showed with the diagram. So hopefully I've convinced you that drawing the diagram is important here as well. So let's look at what would happen if we shift both the supply and the demand. So we have a hurricane and a heat wave. So we can get this happening that the demand curve shifts, for instance, and the hurricane shifts the supply curve. We've already gone over why that is, because of destroying the sugar cane crop. So what happens? Well, the demand curve shifts to the right and the supply curve shifts to the left. So let's draw that now, if that were the case and we have both things happening. So supply curve shifts to the left, demand curve shifts to the right. Now in this case, notice the way I've drawn it, or it's been drawn, in that the demand curve shifted a long way to the right, the supply curve just shifted a small way to the left. What does that tell you? It tells you that the heat wave had a big effect on consumers. They really increased their demand for ice cream. The hurricane didn't seem to have a huge effect, though, on the ice cream producers, so their supply curve only shifted to the left by a small amount. Notice what's happened, though. The price has definitely gone up, and there's no way it couldn't have gone up with those two shifts happening, the shift in the demand and the shift in the supply. At the same time, the quantity or the equilibrium quantity of ice cream has increased. Now, that's due to the magnitude of the shifts in the demand and the supply curve happening. Why? Because I can redraw that diagram where in fact the equilibrium quantity falls compared to Q1. We get a lower equilibrium quantity after the shifts have taken place. How is that? Well, we can have the demand curve shifting out to the right by a small amount. We're going to see this in a second. And the supply decreasing by a large amount. So the opposite of what we had on the left-hand side. So on the right-hand side here you have a small increase in demand and a large decrease in supply. What's the effect? Well, the price has gone up. So unequivocally, in both cases, in other words, we know that the price definitely has gone up. What we don't know, because it depends on the magnitude of the shifts, is whether equilibrium quantity is increased or it's decreased. Okay, so I've shown you that it could either have gone up or gone down. So here you see a table showing you what happens when you get an increase in supply, an increase in demand, what happens to the price and the quantities. In some cases you can see that it's certain. So for instance, if we look at an increase in supply, an increase in demand, you can see in the box here that causes P to be ambiguous. We're not sure if price has gone up or down, but we definitely know that quantity's gone up. In some of your Applia exercises, you're going to go through some of these situations, by the way. But that kind of lists them all. Lastly, I just want to kind of pull this together at the end. There's a lot of slides, as you can see, the 50 slides in this presentation. And we're going to do some examples in the next class as well. But pulling it together, really, the main message from this chapter is that, we talked about economics being the study of how resources are allocated. In our system, prices allocate resources. Prices are basically a signal that guides how much we put into the production of a particular product. You can see that just by the supply curve being upward sloped. If we increase the price, then the suppliers are going to have a tendency to put more resources into producing that product. So the prices are a mechanism for rationing those scarce resources, of allocating those scarce resources to where they make most profits. And it determines really, how much of each good is produced, and who gets the good, because of course which consumer is willing to pay the price determines, which consumers get the good or service. So markets are extremely important in our system, and understanding them is really a basic part of economics, both macro and micro. Okay, I think that's it for the screencast. Sorry it went on quite a long time. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you in class.